people fighting fossil fuel and other extraction projects along with ranchers and other traditional opponents. Trade unions frequently coming together now around the lens of climate jobs and making common cause with other actors in this field. And even in India, where I spent a few weeks documenting a very famous and powerful struggle against a coal-fired power plant in a wetland, you had the poorest of the poor in that part of Andhra Pradesh, subsistence fishers and farmers, getting into a movement together, making a new movement with middle-class townspeople, professionals in the nearby town, and crossing language and cultural and caste and class barriers. And so at the end of this process, when the book and the film were finally coming to an end, we started getting interested in this sort of cross-sectoral organizing ourselves. And we decided to see what was going on in Canada on that front, because we know from a lot of the fights around pipelines and other environmental issues, we've seen First Nations leading, and you see that the First Nations call for implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is the first framing demand in the Leap Manifesto. And under the Indigenous worldview and Indigenous leadership, many other groups are coming to these new coalitions. So we held a meeting last May, and we invited dozens, 60 activists from around the country. 6 provinces were represented in the end. A couple of people from different provinces didn't make it. Life happens. And we had a real constellation of different causes represented in that room for 2 days. There were environmentalists from the mainstream to the direct action crowd. There were trade unionists. The Unifor, the largest private sector union in the country, had a senior person there for the entire 2 days. They represent thousands of workers who work in a refinery in the tar sands extraction zone in northern Alberta. And we had other sort of local labor councils as well. We had First Nations, we had anti-poverty activists, immigration and refugee rights activists, all, obviously working largely on the left and in the environmental sphere, but a huge range of interests. And we spent the first day in a very tough process of talking about historical moments when different movements in Canada had either worked together successfully or failed. And there were lots of successes to celebrate, but there were some very deep wounds between different actors in this coalition. I mean, think about it. You get trade unionists and environmentalists in the room together and talk about working together on common issues. The betrayals and the wounds will come to the surface very quickly, as we've seen in the last week of reporting on the Leap Manifesto and the NDP convention, which I'm happy to get into more as the discussion unfolds. And First Nations and everyone else in the social justice field. When First Nations get together with progressives and from settler communities, they got a lot to teach us, and they feel perennially that we try and fail to get it in a fundamental way. One reason I'm so proud to be standing at a podium where someone took the opportunity not only to acknowledge the territory on which we meet, but to take it as a little popular education moment and explore some of the history that is invisible now, but shaped this land and everything that happened on it for thousands of years. So in that spirit, there's a lot of tensions in the settler First Nation relationship. It's the founding wound of our country. And in this first day of meetings, at a certain point, Naomi looked at me and just said, "This is not going to work. We are not going to overcome this much pain." But we all hung in there, and on the second day, we turned to a question of, what is our common vision that's positive? What is it that we want to build in Canada? What is the country that we want to live in? How much common ground is there among trade unionists and environmentalists and anti-poverty activists and First Nations and refugee and immigrant rights activists and food justice activists around the country that we want and need to build, around the positive and inspiring solutions that we can come up with to confront the existential crisis of climate change and the terrifying daily reality of inequality, of structural racism, and other injustices in our society? And it turned out there was a ton of common ground. It turned out that the common ground resulted in this manifesto. So there are some demands that have been highly controversial for specific political and geographic reasons in the last couple of weeks, like no new fossil fuel infrastructure. But the rest of the manifesto is an expression of positive solutions, much more ambitious, much bolder, much more radical than what's on offer in our political mainstream. A spectrum of political possibilities which has shrunken dramatically in my lifetime. When my father represented this riding in the 1970s, and I spent the first 10 years of my life here, Bill Davis was Premier of Ontario. If you transpose the politics of that time to this time, I'm quite certain Bill Davis in the 1970s wouldn't be a Tory today. I don't even know that he'd be a Liberal today. So the whole spectrum has shifted, and the parties have been crowding in the middle increasingly, but more importantly than the sort of horse race stuff, our sense of what's possible in terms of change in our country has shrunken. And the Leap Manifesto, which was released in the midst of the last federal election campaign, because we were uninspired by the vision on offer from our entire political system, is a much bolder, more ambitious set of demands. So we're looking forward to a country where we use the physical imperative, the scientific necessity of getting ourselves off fossil fuels as quickly as possible, as a massive social justice moment to implement all kinds of other solutions to solve multiple problems at once. Public housing and transport, recognizing the existing low-carbon economy, which is the entire caregiving economy. The major part of our economy, the services we provide in taking care of each other, education, healthcare, daycare, long-term care. This is low-carbon work. Why don't we recognize these vast sectors of employment as green jobs? They're the very ones that have been under attack from endless cuts in the last 3 decades that have been diminished to the point of breaking under the neoliberal policies that we've been living under in these past years. And they're the very ones that need massive reinvestment to restore our capacity to take care of each other and the earth. So there's a huge range of solutions in the Leap Manifesto. We talk about debating a guaranteed annual income. It's a controversial on the left because we know if it's left to right-wing governments, they'll happily dispense with the entire architecture of welfare in order to give people a starvation wage. But if it's actually designed properly, it could guarantee a living wage for all people. Because having a decent life in a rich country like ours is a human right. It's not a privilege that is granted to people. And it would, but we recognize that the guaranteed annual income is a debate. And I think that now that the Ontario Liberals and the Globe and Mail and others are interested in it, it's going to be a contested space where we're going to have to fight for the most progressive version of that policy. But that's in there too, as are issues of structural racism and as are fundamental issues of labor. Because there are, we've been at... Guys, if anyone needs to go for a swim, I totally understand. You don't need to bathe only in my words or each other's for the next hour. So, actually I brought my bathing suit on. I'll be back. At the heart of the manifesto is also a fundamental demand of the trade union movement. There's a significant part of our economy that has always been about resource extraction, and as we understand as a species that there cannot be infinite growth and extraction on a finite planet, we have to have a less extractive economy. And that means that people who have made their living in generations in extraction, whether it's oil or other natural resources, cannot pay the price for the transition off of carbon. The workers are not at fault, and they cannot be abandoned. And so it's fundamental, and it's in the center of the manifesto that those workers have to be taken care of. That there need to be resources for retraining and to make sure that they don't get abandoned. But the more radical demand for me, and the more important one, this is speaking personally, is that workers in carbon-intensive industries have a say in the transition, in a democratic process, that they have a democratic say in how the transition is managed. Now, this part was conveniently invisibilized in the last week of caricatures that we've seen in the mainstream media about how the Leap Manifesto are heartless, downtown elitists who are stabbing a knife in the heart of working people everywhere. That's bullshit. That's not true. That's not who we are. That's not what this is about. But it's an easy caricature with which our political opponents were able to attack us. And I celebrate that because it means we got to them. We got to them. The entire establishment punditocracy in Canada came out with a united voice and said, no, you cannot have this conversation. You are not allowed to talk about transformative change in the face of climate change, let alone with a left-wing agenda. No way, you can't. And then slowly letters to the editor and things on blogs and people's posts on Facebook. Why not? It doesn't sound crazy. It doesn't sound loony to me. So we've had a great healthy debate in the last couple of weeks, maybe the reason why so many people came out today. But the LEAP is this statement, a consensus statement. It was literally written by committee. Doesn't read like it because we had some good writers who were part of the process. That came from a constellation of different social justice movements and represents fundamentally, and I'll repeat it because I think this is the core, a vision of changing the direction of our country that responds to the existential urgency of climate change, the scientific certainty that we have about that crisis, and does it, and the other crises, inequality and structural racism and others, and does it systematically to attack inequality, injustice, marginalization, and exclusion for all communities that are getting the worst end of this current economy. It is, as the last words of This Changes Everything, the documentary suggest, the climate crisis may just be the best chance we've ever had to build a better world, responding to it. Because it tells us that we have to change everything. That doesn't mean we're changing everything tomorrow. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have cars tomorrow. That doesn't mean that we're leaving all oil in the ground and putting, as Ben Mulroney joked recently, that we have to put oil currently out of the ground back in. Although, you know, he doesn't write his own lines, but I thought it was pretty good for reading some comics version of what he might say. None of that is required. What's required is that we get serious about dealing with this crisis. And that we don't leave it to elite interests, to multinational corporations, to shape climate crises for their own purposes. It's not going to do us the kind of good that we need to have Exxon and Shell do the solar panels and the wind turbines. That's why the Leap Manifesto calls for energy democracy. Decentralized renewable energy under community control, where local communities have a say about where it goes and how it unfolds, where local communities, whenever possible, own the new power generation and benefit from the revenues that return from it directly, as they've done in Germany, right? I think it's radical to put this many demands together in an ambitious framework that really tries to change the conversation in our country, but the individual demands are not particularly radical. The energy transition and the notion of energy democracy is happening right now in Germany, where that country has created 400,000 jobs in a little more than a decade. They went from single digits of their percentage of their electricity needs from renewables to 30+% in a little more than a decade. They created 400,000 good clean energy jobs, and more importantly, they created 900 new community cooperatives for energy, where those hundreds and hundreds of local communities own and benefit from the renewable power. I was on As It Happens last week, and they were throwing this example at me. The Leap Manifesto says, if you don't want it in your backyard, it shouldn't be in anyone's backyard. Is that how you feel about wind turbines? Because there's lots of communities that don't like wind turbines. In fact, we did a story on As It Happens this week, where there's a community in southwestern Ontario where this Chicago multinational is coming in with wind turbines, and they have to benefit First Nations under the provincial guidelines, but the First Nations are 1,000 kilometers away, and the people in this community where the turbines are going don't want it. What do you say to that? Or do you know it not in my backyard then? Damn right! Those people weren't consulted. Energy democracy has to do with local control of energy. It's good that the Ontario renewable regulations require that First Nations benefit. It should be the First Nations on whose land the turbines are going. It should be the communities on whose land the new energy infrastructure is going. So of course, when you have a foreign multinational who's just playing by whatever rules the government gives them, they'll find anyone anywhere to throw a few cents to get their investment in, and they won't consult the people where the investment is going. That's the opposite of the vision in the Leap Manifesto. We need to participate in this transition. And when we see our own benefit in it as communities, we will be enthusiastic about it. The head of the Danish wind organization, as quoted in Naomi's book, says that they've gone from NIMBY to pool, please, on our land. And that's the kind of transition that's embodied in the Leap Manifesto. So that's the sort of basics of the vision. There have been a number of developments. Like I said, I'm happy to talk about them with you. You know, it was taken, a version of a resolution to support the Leap Manifesto came to the floor at the NDP convention in Edmonton recently. There were a number of different competing resolutions, but the one that ended up on the plenary floor of the NDP Federal Convention called on the federal NDP to debate the manifesto at the riding level in the next couple of years. It endorsed the spirit of the manifesto, the opportunity to confront inequality and climate crisis with a bold, ambitious agenda. But it said very clearly, the resolution, that the specific policies in the Leap Manifesto should and could be modified according to the needs of different communities. We live in a big country with a lot of different economies and different regional interests. So of course, this very nuanced, very open resolution with lots and lots of wiggle room became presented as the NDP taking a dive off the electability cliff by endorsing this radical tract written by latte-swilling power couples. And ignored the fact that these demands are an expression of different movements in this country that have been making these demands for decades. The only thing new about the Leap Manifesto is that it brings them together with an analysis, and it connects the dots, and it tells it like a story instead of a laundry list. But all of this stuff has been on the table for a long time. Unfortunately, the convention was in Alberta, as you all know, and the Knockley government, the last NDP government, the only NDP government in provincial government in Canada right now, has, in my view, very unfortunately decided to double down on trying to get a new pipeline. They're doing lots of fantastic things in Alberta. For instance, in their budget that came down Thursday, they've lost $10 billion a year of revenue in one go in this price crash, right? $10 billion hole in their budget with the oil price descending from above $100 to under $40 in like a year. And what does a province like that do? Of course, the 45 years of Tory corruption in that province left the Heritage Fund practically dry, left the public finances bare. And so the NDP government brought in a budget last Thursday that responds to a profound economic crisis, one of the most dramatic changes in fortune of any province in our country's history, without imposing austerity. It's amazing. The fact that they responded to this crisis without making people pay for it is really salutary. There's a whole bunch of other things we wish they were doing more on. Their climate action plan, it's unbelievable. It is an exponential leap for Alberta from where they were a year ago to now having a cap on carbon from the tar sands. But that cap allows for significant new expansion of the tar sands, up to 1 million barrels a day. So we're unhappy about that, but we celebrate the fact that they've managed to do it in a very hostile environment with a very, very, very right-wing media and opposition that they get beaten up by every day. So there's a complex thing about discussing these ideas in Alberta. But I want to remind you, because I spent a lot of time in Alberta and shot a significant part of the film in Alberta, that there's lots of people in Alberta who want to do it differently. Greenpeace Alberta released a report a couple of days ago that says that province can create 140,000 jobs in renewable energy, right, with the right policies and the right public investments. That's more jobs that have been lost in the oil and gas industry in the crash. There's a group called Iron and Earth, a young boilermaker who works in the tar sands and has done for years, who's organizing tar sands workers for renewable energy. And they have, I think, between 100 and 200 members now, and the group's only a few weeks old, who are workers who work in the tar sands, who are saying to their government, we want to install solar panels on public schools. Retrain us now, right? So this is an expression of the fact that people are ready to leap around the country, even in Alberta. But the fact that this resolution came to the floor of the NDP convention in Alberta in this particular historic moment was wrenching. And, you know, I'm joking about things that the mainstream pundits have called us. It was harder to hear from allies in Alberta and people who are even friends of ours that we were betraying them, and working people in Alberta, that we were insensitive and ungenerous, that a call for Canada based on caring for the earth and one another was ungenerous. So that was hard, and we're still working through all that stuff. But I think across the country, we are seeing a genuine appetite for much more radical solutions, because we have an urgency gap. If you're not in fetal position under your bed when the newspaper arrives in the morning, as I am most of the time, if you make yourself read the climate news, 93% of the Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral organism on Earth, is subject to bleaching, and half of it in danger of dying. In the last heat wave a few weeks ago in Pakistan, they ran out of room in the morgue. This is real. It's happening everywhere. It's happening here. There was a fuel tanker truck in the Northwest Territories a few weeks ago on one of these communities in the Arctic where you can only get there on an ice road in the winter. the government, for some reason, increased the allowance of how much fuel you could carry in. I mean, these are people who do it every year. They try to adjust how heavy the trucks can be according to the thickness of the ice. Fuel tanker falls through the ice in winter in the Northwest Territory. Like, how many layers of irony do we need that the stuff we're burning in that truck is melting the roads? So we know what's happening. We know it's existential. The science is terrifying. And now we have a whole range of politicians who say, we get it. We go to Paris. We want not just to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. We want to go for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the Trudeau government led that fight in the negotiations in the Paris climate talks. And then they come home and they pass a budget with $3.5 billion for public transit over 3 years. It doesn't start till next year. The TTC alone has $3 billion in backlogs, and that's just for repair. So we're missing something between what we know about what's happening, what we want as Canadians to do our fair share with our capacity to pay for a transition, and our growing emissions that keep growing, and our global responsibility, and the politicians' words, which are fantastic, and then the actual actions, which are utterly insufficient. So we're convinced, as we see rooms fill up like this, as we have 40,000 people today, maybe if you guys all sign, we'll pass the 40,000 mark in Canadians who have signed the Leap Manifesto, and we know that there are 10 times that many who agree with us that we haven't reached yet. I think we know that we're ready to leap as a society, but somehow we have to figure out the calculus of how our passion translates into policy. And that's why the Leap document was launched during a federal election. And that's why it's a nonpartisan effort to affect all political parties, particularly the ones in power, in Queen's Park, to Victoria, to Ottawa. Because those are the political parties who could actually make this stuff law, starting tomorrow, which is about when we need to start. So, rather than blabbing on endlessly, one of the last demands of the Leap Manifesto is that communities across this country hold town hall discussions to articulate what a leap looks like for them. So here we are. It's like the first town hall outside of downtown Toronto, where Canadians have gathered to talk about the Leap Manifesto. So I think this is a unique opportunity to exchange. And I would love to just have a discussion for the rest of our time together with a couple of simple caveats. First of all, we don't have a roaming mic, and so there's a mic in the middle of the room. I don't want you to feel that the people who feel most passionate about speaking, almost always guys at the beginning of an event like this, no offense, sir, not singling you out. Don't feel that because you're not at the microphone you can't speak. I want you to put up your hand and we'll bring you to the mic. We will enforce an aggressive gender parity policy at the microphone. So